A reading from the book of the prophet Ezekiel. The angel brought me back to the entrance of the temple, and I saw water flowing out from beneath the threshold of the temple toward the east. For the facet of the temple was toward the east. The water flowed down from the southern side of the temple, south of the altar. He led me outside by the north gate, and around to the outer gate facing the east, where I saw water trickling from the southern side. He said to me, "This water flows into the eastern district down upon the Arabah, and empties into the sea, the salt waters, which it make fresh. Wherever the river flows, every sort of living creature that can multiply shall live, and there shall be abundant fish. For wherever this water comes, the sea shall be made fresh. Along both banks of the river, fruit trees of every kind shall grow. Their leaves shall not fade, nor their fruit fail. Every month they shall bear fresh fruit, for they shall be watered by the flow from the sanctuary. Their fruit shall serve for food, and their leaves for medicine." Verbum Domini.
Consider the works of the Lord, the redoubtable deeds he has done on the earth. The waters of the river flow the city of God, the holy place where the Most High dwells.
A reading from the first letter of St. Paul to the Corinthians. Brothers and sisters, you are God's building, according to the grace of God given to me. Like a wise master builder, I laid a foundation, and another is building upon it. But each one must be careful how he builds upon it. For no one can lay a foundation other than the one that is there, namely Jesus Christ. Do you not know that you are the temple of God, and that the Spirit of God dwells in you? If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy that person. For the temple of God, which you are, is holy. Verbum Domini.
Chosen and sanctified this house, says the Lord, that my name may retain in it for all time. Alleluia, alleluia, alleluia.
Dominus vobiscum. Lectio Sancti Evangelii secundum Ioannem.
Gloria tibi, Domine.
Since the Passover of the Jews was near, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. He found in the temple area those who sold oxen, sheep, and doves, as well as money changers seated there. He made a whip out of cords and drove them all out of the temple area with the sheep and the oxen, and spilled the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. And to those who sold doves, he said, "Take these out of here and stop making my Father's house a marketplace." His disciples recalled the words of Scripture, "Zeal for your house will consume me." At this, the Jews answered and said to him, "What sign can you show us for doing this?" Jesus answered and said to them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jews said, "This temple has been under construction for 46 years, and you will raise it up in 3 days. And he was speaking about the temple of his body. Therefore, when he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they came to believe the Scriptures and the word Jesus had spoken. Verbum Domini.
Laus tibi, Christe.
Today we celebrate the dedication of St. John Lateran Basilica in Rome. This is a major celebration for the church because it's a great victory. The church had been undergoing the worst persecution that Rome had to give under Diocletian. Diocletian was destroying churches all over the empire and killing Christians in very large numbers. He was instigated by one of his own generals whose mother practiced witchcraft. And as a witch, she wanted to see Christianity wiped out. So this was one of the things that was going on in the background. And Diocletian didn't care one way or the other, but went along with it. Well, when he died, the man who won the battle to become the new emperor over East and West was Constantine. And his mother was a Christian, St. Helena. This was a radical shift. So much so that what the emperor did was have the empire help to rebuild churches, but also he gave one of the palaces, a basilica-type palace. A basilica originally meant a place where the king was, because the Greek word for king is basileus. And so the king would be in a basilica, and there would be an alcove in the back for his throne. So he gave the Lateran Basilica to the Pope, and this became the Cathedral Church of Rome. And the difference was that the king was no longer Constantine or Diocletian or some other Roman emperor, but Christ was put in that alcove, in that back. Christ is the new king. And that's why we celebrate this great feast. And today's readings bring out three aspects of what it means to have this temple. On one hand, we see in the gospel, Jesus is clearing out the temple during a Jubilee year. The year would be about the year 27 AD. And he begins his public ministry. We can tell that because they say it's 46 years since they started to build the temple. And they started to build it in 19 BC. There is no year zero, so this would make it 27. So, and that also ends up being one of the Jubilee years, because they had begun building the temple 4 years after the previous Jubilee. So we have this, we can have a sense of what's going on here. And he declares himself to be the one who is the new temple. He is going to be the focus of worship. Now that's amazing. He always showed respect for the Jewish temple. Remember in the Gospel of Luke, he said that he wanted to be in his Father's house. And he would come and worship in the temple. He would come and teach in the temple. But he also knew that he himself would personally be the one who replaces it. The temple in Judaism was the only place where sacrifice could be offered. You could not offer sacrifice in any other place in the whole world. That temple is it. Now, Christ is going to be the new temple. But it won't be like the temple of Jerusalem, a place that is fixed geographically. Christ is the new temple where we offer sacrifice, because he is not only the temple, he's also the high priest. He's also the sacrifice. All of this is Christ. And so whenever and wherever we worship Christ, and wherever we come to offer that one sacrifice of his body and blood, he is that temple. And that's going to be key. And so that the church doesn't have only St. John Lateran as the only church in the world. That's just the Cathedral of Rome, where the Pope is centered and where the Pope reigns as Bishop of Rome. St. Peter's is a basilica as well, but it's not the cathedral. St. John Lateran is. And it's named after both John the Evangelist and John the Baptist. This is something, though, that is only one place. We can build temples, we can build churches all over the place, because Christ is going to be present in each and every one of them. And he's going to be the king at the center and focus of all our attention. And if we don't allow Christ to be the temple and the focus, Christ who died for us to offer the sacrifice, and who rose again from the dead so that it would be an eternal sacrifice. If we don't have him as the center, then it's something that's worthless. A second sense of the temple is what St. Paul teaches us in 1 Corinthians, that we also, the church, form that temple. So that it's not only going to be in a building, it's wherever the church community is gathered. And we have seen over the centuries, the worst of all being the 20th century, that the church had to gather in many different places besides buildings that designated as churches. How many times priests offered Holy Mass in prison camps under the Communist Chinese, under the Nazis, under the Communists of Soviet Union, sometimes fermenting raisins in order to make wine and be able to offer the holy sacrifice of the Mass with great danger to themselves. And even though they did not have, like one priest I knew, his mother smuggled, he was in a Chinese camp, his mother smuggled hosts to him in care packages. She would send him Necco candies, and in between each Necco she would put a host. And she smuggled wine as medicine, called it as medicine, but it was wine. He could use the bottle cap as a chalice, not a beautiful chalice, but it was all he had. And it was one of the most precious chalices in the world, as he would offer Mass and be able to give communion to the other prisoners, breaking each host into the tiniest of fragments. That was where the church was, among those people in that prison. Not a beautiful place, not a place with glorious vestments, but a place where a priest had memorized the words of Holy Mass and celebrated it and was able to share the Eucharist with those who were there with him. This is where the church is as well as among us. And we have to remember that that's our role, that we also are going to be the church. And the way we act, we may not be the same decorations that we have in a beautiful chapel like this, but our deeds need to be our decoration. Our deeds need to be our adornment. And how we act toward God, our worship and our prayer. This is going to be the adornment that we bring. And this is going to be something to remind us of on this feast day. The first reading that we had brings in the third aspect of church, namely the physical temple. And that is not unimportant. It is important to have a beautiful place. That's why we celebrate that this handing over of a Roman palace to become the Cathedral of Rome is an important feast day. And our churches are important. It's not that just because Jesus is the temple and just because we are the church and we as a community form the church, that does not mean that the physical places where we worship are unimportant. They are important. Our celebrations of Holy Mass in various churches is augmented by the beauty of the place, the dignity with which it's built, that which reminds us of so many things of our faith in the art. All of these things are very important, and in the vision of Ezekiel, which also happened in a Jubilee year, the Jubilee of 572 BC. And in that Jubilee vision, he saw something miraculous. You see, in Jerusalem, there is a spring, the Gihon spring, and that's at the base of the Temple Mount. You go down the base of the Temple Mount and just a little bit to the south of it, and there's a spring coming out of Mount Zion. And that spring is still there, and it still gives water, and the water is still used to this day. That's why Jerusalem has been there for 5,000 years. That spring is a source of the city. But he sees a different vision, something that would not be by nature, but by a miracle, that there's going to be a spring that comes from the top of the Temple Mount, and that the rebuilt temple will be a source of life-giving water, and that the water will flow so wide that there'll be a river, and the river is so powerful that it's able to flow out into the desert. And believe me, the desert has nothing there. I mean, it is empty. There's barely any grass for the sheep and the goats. There's hardly anything in that desert to this day. And for that to have trees that are giving fruit, and the leaves are for the healing of the nations. This is amazing. But even more amazing is that it flows into the Dead Sea, because the valley that flows from the east side of Jerusalem flows right to the Dead Sea and comes out right at Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. And it flows into the Dead Sea from there. This water is so powerful that it's able to make the salt water of the Dead Sea fresh. Now, we live in places, in a country that has many rivers, and no matter how much fresh water pours from the Mississippi into the Gulf of Mexico stays salty. There's no river that we have that flows into the ocean and makes the ocean into sweet water. That doesn't happen. The ocean is not nearly as salty as the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea is 9 times as salty as the ocean. Oceans are 3% salt. The Dead Sea is 27% salt. To turn that Dead Sea into a freshwater lake would be a miracle of a tremendous order. And this is something that is a great symbol for our own Jubilee. We celebrated the Jubilee of the year 2000, the beginning of this new millennium. And I was reflecting on how one of the things that should flow out of the church is the living water of God's grace to flow into our culture, because our culture is so often like a desert. There's so much area of our culture where there's no life. As a matter of fact, it becomes a culture of death. And it's so much of it is like the Dead Sea. And as a church, flowing from Christ through us and out of the buildings that we make, the grace of God is to flow into the society so that it can have life within it. This is part of our own task, to allow the Lord to use us so that that fresh water that brings life and transforms the deadly into the life-giving. That is part of what we need to learn from this vision, and that the Lord wants to do it. Now, this happened when you think back on St. John Lateran being a church from which flowed a life that changed the Roman Empire from a dead, not merely dead and dying, but a death-dealing empire where thousands and thousands of people were martyred for the faith. And it could look to the people of the time of Diocletian as if that culture of death, where death had been celebrated as a Roman culture, from the arena all the way through the lines of crucifixions and beheadings, that culture of death could be transformed, and that transformation was symbolized but also effected by helping to change this basilica from a place where the emperor was the god into one in which God is the God. And the Roman Empire changed and became a Christian empire. Slavery was eventually eliminated. The games, the pornography at the theater, all of those were eventually eliminated. And this was a complete transformation. And even when the barbarians came, eventually the barbarians themselves were converted. There was a river flowing from that temple into a culture of death. If that could happen with the Roman Empire, we should never, ever lose hope that it can happen with ours, that our society also can be transformed. It takes a lot of work and a lot of willingness on our part to be at the service of Jesus Christ, the temple, but to allow him to use us to have that life-giving water flow into society and bring life. This is the task at hand as we celebrate this feast of the dedication of St. John Lateran.